right, so this is beginning our first panel. Karl Marx had your number. His writing slammed today's left tendencies. It's presented by Marxist-Humanist Initiative. We're an organization dedicated to promoting and developing the ideas of Marxist-Humanism. And in our first session, you're going to hear from 4 speakers speaking about the ideas of Marx and how they dismantle many of the prevailing leftist tendencies. We're going to begin with a presentation from Andrew Kliman called "Is Capitalism Exploitative?"
I'm going first.
Yes, you're going first in this one. Is capitalism exploitative? Why G.A. Cohen's plain argument fails while Marx's theory succeeds. You'll next be hearing from Theresa zooming in, and Francisco Palacios, also zooming in, and then lastly, but only in order, not in importance, and Jaclard.
Okay, so I'm going to have to speak quickly, but hopefully not too quickly. Marx's exploitation theory is based on his value theory. He said that workers' labor is the sole source of new value. G.A. Cohen tried to replace Marx's exploitation theory with his own argument that he called the plain argument. And it's a physicalist argument, an alternative to Marx. The key proposition is the laborer is the only person who creates the product. What I want to argue here is that the plain argument fails. It's logically invalid precisely because of its physicalism. In the same paper where he presented the plain argument, Cohen put forward a critique of Marx's argument, and I'll briefly, if I have time, talk about how it fails as well. The critique of Marx's argument by Cohen, because Cohen wrongly fused together creation and determination of value, which are, however, different concepts. Despite its obvious, at least to me, flaws, Cohen's plain argument is still being touted. J. Cohen, by the way, was a very well-known analytical Marxist philosopher. Okay, it's still being touted. For instance, a master's thesis several years ago said that Cohen's definition shows that even in the case that value is derived from other factors than labor, there can be exploitation. And Ben Burgess, a philosopher, a logician, and a Jacobin author, wrote in 2019, as the great 20th century Marxist philosopher G.A. Cohen persuasively argues in the final sections of his plain argument paper, Marx's theory of exploitation is logically detachable from his theory of value. No, it isn't. That's what I want to show. It's not logically detachable. Okay, here is Cohen's plain argument, and it's just plain bad. The laborer is the only person who creates the product, that which has value. The capitalist receives some of the value of the product. Therefore, the laborer receives less value than the value of what he creates, and the capitalist receives some of the value of what the laborer creates. Therefore, the laborer is exploited by the capitalist. So says Cohen. To understand the argument, you need to know the technical specification of a few terms here. First, as he points out in the essay, what he means by laborer, it's not like a class position. Any person who is directly producing a product, even if they're an owner, like of a factory, if they're directly involved in producing the product, they're counted as a laborer here. What does it mean to create the product? It means to directly produce it. But indirect contributions to production don't count, just direct production. And exploitation. What does Cohen mean by exploitation? Well, if someone contributes more than they receive, they are exploited. The way he puts it is unjust exploitation to obtain something from someone without giving him anything in return, under certain conditions, etc. But that's the key, is contribution in excess of receipt. Okay, the first problem we face with this argument is that Cohen, when he talks about create, is just talking about direct production of physical products, but not all contributions, but the definition of exploitation refers to all contributions. It's true that the laborer, as defined by Cohen, is the only person who creates the product, okay? But exploitation, as defined by Cohen, is a matter of contribution in excess of receipt. Okay, contribution, not creation or direct production. There's all kinds of contributions to physical production. Okay, there's direct creation by workers, but also by non-labor inputs. Tools, raw materials, machines. Cohen said, I don't deny that tools and raw materials are usually needed to produce what has value. And then there are the indirect contributions to physical production made by capitalists, suppliers of non-labor inputs, lenders, governments, criminals, we'll get to criminals, and so forth. How do they contribute? Well, capitalists organize production, some of them. They make investment decisions and maybe other things. Suppliers of non-labor inputs, land owners, people who own machinery, they make their inputs available for use in production. Lenders supply funds, make them available for use in production. Governments provide a legal framework within which production can take place. Marx pointed out that criminals, indirectly produce. The criminal produces not only crimes, but also criminal law. And the professor who gives lectures on criminal law, and the whole of the police and criminal justice, and it went on and on and on, etc. So all kinds of people and inputs contribute to physical production. Once we take account of this, you can see how the plain argument is just plain bad, even if we only focus on the role of the non-labor inputs, not the other human beings besides the laborer. The laborer is the only person who creates the product, but non-labor inputs also create the product. Okay, the capitalist receives some of the value, the laborer receives less than the value of what he and the non-labor inputs create. The capitalist receives some of the value what the laborer and the non-labor inputs create, and therefore no conclusion about exploitation of the laborer by the capitalist can be derived. Steps 1 through 4 do not show that the capitalist receives some of the value of what the laborer, rather than the non-labor inputs, creates. Okay? Capitalist receives some, but maybe that can be attributed to the non-labor inputs contribution to physical production. So steps 1 to 4 certainly do not show that the capitalist receives some of the portion of the product's value that's attributable to the laborer's activity, rather than to the direct and indirect contributions to physical production made by not only the non-labor inputs, tools, machinery, land, but also by the capitalists, the suppliers of the non-labor inputs, your lenders, your governments, your good old criminals, and so forth. Okay, so the failure of the plain argument is a failure due to its physicalism. Marx's exploitation theory says that only workers' labor contributes to the creation of new value. Value is not something physical. But Cohen's plain argument works really by what's meant to be a strict analogy to Marx's argument. So what it needs to do is to say that only workers' labor contributes to physical production. But that's patently false. To distract our attention from this basic fact, the plain argument conjures away the fact that non-labor inputs are also directly producing physical products, just like workers are. And if you want to talk about workers being active, well, machines are pretty active. And the plain argument unobtrusively substitutes creates for contributes, because it needs to talk about contribution greater than receipt, you got exploitation. Okay, because Marx's argument is about something non-physical, creation of new value, it doesn't need to duck and weave to distract our attention from the basic facts regarding physical production. That there are many kinds of things that are producing physical products. That there are many kinds of contributions, direct and indirect, to physical production. That many kinds of people and other entities, governments, criminals, make contributions to physical production. So I would submit that Marx's argument is the real plain argument. It states plainly that workers' labor is the exclusive source of new value. It doesn't mess around with this physical stuff. How am I doing with time?
You're at 9 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, so I do have time to go into what was in the same paper by Cohen before he gets to this plain argument analogy with Marx, meant to be the good physical, alternative to Marx. He tries to knock down Marx's own argumentation. And it's been widely accepted that it's successful, but it really isn't. So Cohen basically claimed that Marx's theory was self-contradictory. On the one hand, you've got Marx's argument regarding exploitation, and it says that labor creates value, and it needs that notion of creation of value. But, says Cohen, if you look at Marx's value theory, the strict version, it says that a commodity's value is determined by the amount of labor that's currently needed to produce it, not by the actual amount of labor that was expended to produce it in the past. So supposedly creation of value has nothing to do with the determination of value. Cohen claims that those two things are incompatible. Okay. Actually, both A and B are correct. Marx's theory says that labor creates value, and it says that the commodity's value is determined by the amount of labor currently needed. But there simply is no contradiction between propositions A and B, because creation and determination are not contradictory concepts. Creation and determination are not the same thing. If they were exactly the same thing, that would make these two, A and B, contradictory. Creation, determination, not the same thing. In Marx's theory, a commodity's value is created once when the commodity is produced. Okay? Workers work, they produce a product, at the same time they're creating value. But the determination of a commodity's value, the original determination of its value at that moment when the thing's produced, and all of the subsequent revaluations, that's an ongoing process. So the commodity's value isn't determined once and for all when it's created. It gets revalued in accordance with new production conditions of what's needed at a later time, and so forth. But the determination of a commodity's value after it's produced, that is the phenomenon of revaluation, that is just irrelevant to the issue of exploitation. It's the workers who are creating the product that are being exploited, not the commodity that's being sold in the market that's being exploited. Okay, so what's relevant to the issue of exploitation and Marx's explanation of the source of profit is the creation of value at the time of production, not the subsequent revaluations. Okay, that is the conclusion of my short presentation, but I've got a whole article about this at the following URL on the MHI website in our publication, The Sober Census. So if you click on the website and go to our publication, you'll see the article is Marx Systematically Exploited by Burgess. Okay, so if you go to the search, type in G.A. Cohen, Burgess, exploitation, you'll find it.
Okay, I'll just jump right in. In 1943, the Soviet journal, under the banner of Marxism, published an article that argued the law of value operated in socialist societies. This enabled the authors to claim that the USSR was a socialist society. Yet, the idea that the law of value operates in a socialist society directly contradicts Karl Marx's argument that the law of value operates only within capitalist societies. Thus, the Soviet economists were in a bind. To get out of this bind, they either had to, 1, distort Marx's writings to prove that the law of value could operate in a non-capitalist society, or 2, truthfully interpret Marx's writings and acknowledge the USSR was a capitalist society, at least according to Marx. I will argue today that the Soviet revision of the law of value obfuscates the existence of state capitalism. In my view, it is still important to understand the Soviet revision, if only to reject it finally and definitively, because there is still a problem in the left of equating socialism with state capitalism. For example, some Marxists will tell us that China is a socialist country, or will defend retroactively that the USSR was, despite both of those countries having capitalist relations of production. Equating socialism with state capitalism, it must be said, not only leads Marxists to defend indefensible capitalist regimes, it also diverts us from the true goal of class struggle, the self-emancipation of the working class. Thus, I'll discuss 2 things today. First, how the Soviet economists distorted Marx's writings to make the law of value appear trans-historical, and second, the social relations of production that exist if the law of value operates. The Soviet revision of the law of value is this: that the law of value is a trans-historical phenomenon. It existed in pre-capitalist societies and can exist in socialist societies. In the introduction to her English translation of the 1943 Soviet article, called A New Revision of Marxian Economics, Raya Donnelly wrote, quote, "The whole significance of the article turns upon whether it is possible to conceive of the law of value functioning in a socialist society, that is, a non-exploitative society," end quote. The Soviet economists say it is conceivable, of course. Donnelly put it mildly when she said that the way that they proved this was interesting. I would call it a moral and intellectual disgrace. According to Donnelly, the Soviet economists proceeded, quote, from the empirical fact of the existence of the USSR, assumed socialism was irrevocably established, and then propounded certain laws of a socialist society, end quote. Donnelly argued that these laws are, quote, precisely the ones that emanate from a capitalist society, end quote. In other words, rather than measuring reality by the idea of socialism in Marx's writings, the Soviet economists twisted Marx's writings to conform to the state capitalist reality of the USSR. Under the duress of Stalin's direct orders, they did this in 2 ways. The Soviet economists cherry-picked a couple of quotes from Capital and the Critique of the Goethe program, where Marx used the word value while discussing post-capitalist society. They then interpreted these quotes in a way that is incoherent, not only with other things Marx says in these works, and different works, but also with the general argument of these works and his philosophical political project. The Soviet economists also misrepresented one of Engels' arguments to suggest in Donnelly's words, the law of value has operated not only in capitalism, but has existed from time immemorial. Just to clarify, this is what the Soviet economists were trying to get across, not what Donnelly was trying to get across. Donnelly's introduction clarifies that Marx and Engels believed the law of value only operates in a capitalist society. First, she quotes Engels, saying value is, quote, a category characteristic only of commodity production. And just as it did not exist prior to commodity production, so will it disappear with the abolition of commodity production, end quote. She then quotes Marx, explaining that the theory of value was developed, quote, for the explanation of bourgeois society, end quote. The difference between Donnelly's use of quotations and the Soviet economist is that Donnelly interprets these phrases of Marx and Engels in a way that adheres to the internal coherence in these two thinkers' writings rather than establishes incoherence. According to interpretation standards, interpretations that produce inconsistencies should be rejected if there are interpretations that can produce consistency. Put plainly, because Donnelly's interpretation is coherent, the incoherent Soviet interpretation should be discarded. This controversy, however, is not simply a matter of hermeneutics. The law of value refers to the discovery that labor is the source of all value, and that only socially necessary labor time adds value to a product. According to Marx, socially necessary labor time is the time it takes to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. Thus, if most furniture companies can produce tables in 5 hours, and all the labor time that goes into making a table after that 5 hours does not add any value. But if a furniture company can produce a table with half as much labor, that table will have just as much value as the other tables. So, capitalists strive and must strive to reduce the amount of labor they use to produce commodities. If they do not, they will not increase their profits. The result of this striving is constant speed-ups. To use less labor, capitalists must introduce more efficient technology. But more efficient technology from the worker's point of view means busier and more dangerous work. And for many, it means layoffs. The law of value, then, is a manifestation of capitalist social relations at the point of production, a consequence of exchange being the purpose of production. I know this is a rushed explanation of the law of value, but I don't have much time. For a more thorough summary of Marx's interpretation of the law of value, I encourage you to listen to episodes 109 and 110 of the Marxist-Humanist podcast, Radio Free Humanity, where Andrew and I discuss the law of value and the Soviet revision in detail. Regardless, the point I'm driving here is that capitalist production relations are present if the law of value operates in a society. In other words, capitalist exploitation of labor still occurs in that society, whatever it calls itself. Allow me to explain how this exploitation is specifically capitalist. Marx identified labor within the capitalist mode of production as having a dual character. Labor has a concrete character and an abstract character. The concrete character is the type of activity, cooking, carpentry, sewing, etc. The abstract character is that these activities are also simply labor in general. Different concrete labors become equivalent as labor in general, making it possible to determine socially necessary labor time within a given society. Simply put, it is abstract labor that creates value. If the law of value operates, there is value. If there is value, there is abstract labor. If there is abstract labor, there is, quote, alienated labor, labor estranged not merely from the product of its toil, but also in regard to the very process of expenditure of its labor power, end quote. Another way to say this is that the energy workers expend during the capitalist production process does not contribute directly to their own well-being. Instead, the energy they expend contributes to the production of value, which becomes the condition of the capitalist production process itself. Therefore, the energy they expend reproduces their separation from the means of production and the things they produce, and thus the exact capitalist social relations that ensure their continued exploitation. The conclusion I want everyone to take from this is that human being is, at best, an incidental factor in societies where the law of value operates. Forget about human flourishing. I want everyone to understand that Marxists, who suggest that the law of value operates in a socialist society, suggest that human flourishing is not the aim of socialist society. I want you to understand that these Marxists are saying that in a socialist society, workers will be constantly pushed to produce faster and faster for the purpose of exchange. They're also saying that the state, not workers, will be directly responsible for managing these exchanges. Thus, they are saying that workers won't own the means of production and won't be in control of the production process. These Marxists are saying that somehow everything has changed for workers while nothing has changed. What the Soviet economists did in 1943 and what many Marxists today are doing when they say China, for example, is a socialist society, is equating socialism with state capitalism. By doing so, they have accommodated themselves to the eternal existence of capitalist production. To put it frankly, they have abandoned the class struggle. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to speak about the lower face of communism within the critique of the Gotha program, which was a text that Theresa just alluded to in her presentation. So here we go. Let me put that the timer on. Sorry. Okay, written in 1875, that's 8 years after publishing Capital, Marx's critique of the Gotha program calls for a definitive break with Lassalle, I guess that's how you pronounce it, sorry, I don't know French, and his faction. The critique attacked the severe theoretical regression that Lassalleanism brought to the socialist movement. Lassalleanism eventually came to dominate the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, and focused its attention on distribution while neglecting the transformations in the mode of production that would be necessary to achieve socialism. Against Lassalle, Marx defines and outlines the essential characteristics of the lower face of communism, pointing out the changes in the mode of production that need to happen as this new society necessarily arises from a concrete, historically determined capitalist society. Lassalle is long dead, but the ideas that substitute revolution for distribution continue to dominate in the socialist movement. This is because these ideas are common sense in our society. They are the ideas of the bourgeoisie. They don't question the way in which reality appears to us. And you know, if you read Capital, you'll notice that a lot of the content is about understanding the appearance of things. It is sad to say that today we still have to fight for the defense of these intellectual achievements against the so-called Marxists of our time, who think bourgeois common sense is enough to define socialism. In our denunciation of the rest of the left, we echo Marx's own words in 1875. He said, "Our position is altogether remote. We have nothing to do with it." Let me talk about objective alienation. The distribution of the means of production is a determining building block for the rest of society. The way that these means of production are distributed across different epochs of human history determine the type of society that is built upon those relations. The distribution of consumption, the development of culture, even the social conceptions of justice are all built upon these relations. So let's see what Marx says. He says in the critique, "The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers in the form of property and capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. Because the land and means of production have been taken away from the workers and are owned by the landlords and the capitalists, the wage appears as the mediating factor between means of production and work. This necessary mediation, given the capitalist form in which the means of production are distributed, has a specific way of appearing to the eye. It appears as the value or as the price of work, when in fact it is only the price of the ability to work, or as Marx calls it, labor power in a masked form. It was made clear, this is Marx, that the wage worker has permission to work for his own subsistence, that is, to live only insofar as he works for a certain time for free for the capitalist, and hence also for the latter's consumer, for the capitalist. That the whole capitalist system of production turns on the increase of this free labor by extending the working day or by developing the productivity, that is, increasing the intensity of labor power, etc. That consequently, the system of wage labor is a system of slavery, and indeed of a slavery which becomes more severe in proportion as the social productive forces of labor develop, whether the worker receives better or worse payment. That's Marx. Non-revolutionary currents that go no further than the idea of improving wages rest on theoretical principles from an era before Marx's contributions. These redistributionist positions take the appearance of the wage relation at face value without thinking for a second that its form of appearance hides a deeper truth. Marx discovered that the capitalist relation pushes the working class to work at an ever-increasing pace for the requirements of valorization and the permanent expansion of that valorization. The wage relationship permanently reproduces the condition of human subjection to capital, reproduces and expands capital as a materially objective power over the worker. It is this eternal, alert, and ever-worsening situation that must be abolished at the root. Marx wrote, "If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one. Vulgar socialism," says Marx, "has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent from the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution." He asked, "After the real relation has long been made clear, why retrogress?" I've touched on the need to eliminate the problem at its root, and we're running out of time, so I will now speak on what Marx specifically mentions in the critique about this. You'll find basically 7 detailed paragraphs about this. The 4 new features of socialist production as it rises out of capitalist society, in the order that Marx writes them down, are: 1, the means of production will become common property. 2, products will not be exchanged by their producers. 3, work imbued into objects will not appear as value of the products, as a material attribute of the products. And number 4, individual concrete work will no longer be a part of total labor through mediation, but immediately. The distribution of land and the means of production have changed. It has ceased to be capitalist distribution and has become communist distribution of means of production. That is, means of production are common property. This means that distribution of the means of consumption is now under the control of the workers, precisely because production is now under control of the workers. In a capitalist system, distribution is mediated by wages and money because the specific characteristic of the capitalist system is that of separate, privately owned units of capital that compete against each other for creating and appropriating surplus value through the production of commodities by wage labor. The exchange of money and commodities is necessary for circulating commodities through society, but now a plan for production can be made by the commune. The producers are now the consumers. There is no longer any reason to produce commodities for exchange, as exchange is no longer necessary. Commodity production ceases and production of use values becomes the dominating form of production. Products are useful objects only insofar as their physical products make them useful for a specific purpose. Money is abolished. All labor is immediately at the service of the needs of society. In capitalist society, labor was only at the service of society through a roundabout of commodity production, but this mediation has ceased to exist or be necessary. Labor has become directly social. Society is now able to make its own decisions about how to use its capacities. There is no longer any incentive to exploit society's capacity to labor beyond what society itself needs. In other words, there is no longer any need for surplus labor. All work undertaken by the commune is by definition necessary labor. Just like washing dishes or doing laundry, the work is over when the required work is completed, though it feels like I'm always washing dishes. Inefficient machines no longer cause work in the industrially underdeveloped countries to be degraded into underpaid labor. 1 hour of labor in machine A materializes exactly the same amount of labor as 1 hour of labor in machine B, no matter the technical differences in machinery. Every hour of work counts as an hour of human work, no matter what country you are from. I'm going to skip some sections on townships because we don't have time. I just want to add just one final point, and we'll have enough time. The role of scientific responsibility in the socialist movement. Marx described the necessary characteristics of communist society Marx described the necessary characteristics of a communist society emerging from capitalism. If a revolution achieves these 4 social transformations, it would effectively enter communism. Envisioning the lower phase of communism concretely, as Marx did, represents the correct scientific approach that revolutionary organizations must have. It provides us with a tangible, realistic goal to pursue, saving us from chasing illusions. However, many so-called Marxist organizations deny, obscure, or distort these fundamental characteristics. Instead, they substitute the scientific concept of the lower phase of communism with conditions Marx never endorsed and sometimes explicitly opposed. These groups represent theoretical regressions in our movement. By employing rhetorical tricks, these groups push the actual communist transformation of society into a distant and unreachable future that is always conceptually murky. They claim that only after unrealistic and big achievements through the power of the bourgeois state, what they dubbed the transitional period and substitute for the lower stage of communism, we might one day have our pie in the sky. Time and again, they give center stage to distribution. These groups are not guides, but obstacles. They embody intellectual defeats and they surrender theoretical achievements. Committed socialists must draw the line and break with these groups. Abstract organizational unity is counter-revolutionary when the cost is theoretical underdevelopment. Sectarianism in our organization is not a matter of headcount, but of dogmatic thinking and behavior. We urge you to make no compromises in the defense of theory. A split with obscurantism in our movement is still as necessary today as it was back then. Sorry for extending over time on that.
Okay, my topic is much smaller than what we've been discussing, and I'm very glad that anyone is discussing world revolution, socialist revolution, and what it is, and I hope we'll continue that so we have some idea what we're working for. But I'm just trashing the left in this talk because all they talk about is distribution, is why are some people poor, why are some people rich, can't we even it out and then everyone will be happy. Now, in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx completed his intellectual break with the other socialists of his day, 1875. Francisco talked about this. The Gotha program is basically a list of demands that socialists should make on the Kaiser. The demands center on a method of distribution that's different from market-determined distribution. The writers had missed entirely what Marx had laid out in Capital about the nature and development of capitalism and revolution. The authors of the Gotha program seemingly labored under the misconception that they could tinker with distribution to make the current system fair instead of unfair. And most importantly, they implied that doing so would change the nature of the society. They don't say that would make outright revolution and a new mode of production unnecessary, but that is the implication. And that's, I think, very important for us today to know. I want to consider what was so wrong with the Gotha program and why the same errors have been repeated continuously through nearly every Marxist movement since 1875 and even today. Every other contradiction and struggle fades away as the left concentrates now on opposing rich versus poor people, rich versus poor nations, the 98% versus 2%, and it calls for equality of income as the solution. Forget about the level of development, the role of imperialism other than its role in distribution, inequality of natural resources, differences in population. everything fades in importance compared to income and wealth inequality, these people say. And they explain everything. Marx lays out precisely why they're wrong. The distribution of means of consumption, income, he says, is only a result of how property and means of production is distributed. Given present-day distribution of the means of production, the present-day distribution of means of consumption follows automatically. It can't be fundamentally different. To have the new relations of income distribution that the Gaza program calls for, we would first need a revolutionary change in the mode of production, including revolutionary change in the distribution of the means of production. Andrew Kliman has an article on the particular Gaza program on our website from September of 22. And it lays out in detail what Marx writes in his commentary to his comrades about this concept of fair distribution. He says, do not the bourgeois assert the present-day distribution is, quote, fair? And is it not, in fact, the only fair distribution on the basis of the present-day mode of production? Are economic relations regulated by legal conceptions? Or do not, on the contrary, legal relations arise from economic ones? Have not also the socialist sectarians the most varied notions about, quote, fair distribution? Andrew comments, although Marx phrased these criticisms in the form of questions, it should be clear that he was affirming that present-day distribution is indeed the only, quote, fair distribution on the basis of the present-day mode of production. Andrew says, Marx wrote that a particular society's distribution of consumption goods is a consequence of, results automatically from, its particular distribution of the conditions of production. He also criticized the draft program for treating relations of distribution as independent of rather than dependent upon the mode of production, and thus for portraying redistribution as the crux of socialist transformation. Marx wrote, quote, the vulgar socialists have taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution. After the real relation has long been made clear, why retrogress again? And that real relation, he's undoubtedly thinking of his own work, Capital, which reveals the actual relations. Marx went on to say that right, in this case distributional rights, can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development, which this determines. Andrew comments that this remark pithily summarizes his concretization of the base superstructure relation with respect to production and distribution, how they are related in capitalism, in the lower phase of communism, and in its higher phase. In all three cases, rights to the product are only as high as society's economic structure. The present-day distribution of income is fair given the capitalist mode of production. That's how capitalism works. The different norms of economic distribution in the lower phase of communism will be fair given the degree of development of the communist mode of production in its lower phase. And the still different norms of distribution in the higher phase will be fair given the now higher degree of development of the communist mode of production. Then why do we think we can change the world by means of non-capitalist forms of distribution? Is this even possible? We find class society everywhere in rich and poor countries, so it may seem to people that it's natural. If we start our analysis with that given, then it's easy to think the problem can be solved without getting rid of class society by evening out the income of the classes. In chapter 51 of volume 3 of Capital, Marx addresses this way of thinking. He says that the standard conception is that both capitalist production and capitalist distribution are natural, in conformity with natural law and human nature. But reformers disagree. He had in mind especially John Stuart Mill. They recognize that capitalism's relations of distribution have arisen historically and can be changed. Quote, but they hold all the more firmly to the supposedly more constant character of the relations of production themselves as arising from human nature and hence independent of all historical development. Close quote. He goes on to say that scientific analysis proves the contrary, that both the relations of production and the relations of distribution, which are the reverse side of the same coin, have a specific historical and transitory character. In other words, they can be changed. We are not dealing with just John Stuart Mill 150 years ago. The same problem is endemic to the consciousness of reformers today. They don't see what could possibly be historically specific and changeable about the relations of production. They think of production as a technical matter, doing the work. What they don't recognize is that the social character of labor, relation between people doing work, it's indirect, but in socialist society it will be direct. And that is a transformation in the relation of individuals to society. And what is it we produce in capitalism? It's not just goods and services, but value, abstract wealth, which is historical and transitory. It can and will be changed. And above all, the aim of production now is the ceaseless expansion of value, while in socialism, objective wealth will just be there to satisfy the workers' own needs for their own development. Bear in mind that everything I've just talked about has to do with relations of production, not distribution, not how many apples we get. Behind Marx's view is reasoning based on the fact that distribution is a consequence of the relations of production. Put most simplistically, we can say that if proletarians were as well off as capitalists, they would make even an income, the workers would stop working and society would collapse. Let us look further at what is so wrong with the Gotha program and at why the same errors were and are repeated continuously even today.